My patron Mason has said, "Hi Tik, Q&A question. It's a two-parter, both about the 82nd Airborne Division's role in the Battle of the Bulge." 1. The 101st Airborne Division certainly gets the lion's share of the fame because of the Siege of Bastogne. But could it be argued that the 82nd played a comparably important role by, alongside the 30th Infantry Division, blocking Kampfgruppe Peiper's route to the Meuse early in the offensive? 2. Montgomery's decision, after American First Army was placed under his command, to withdraw 82nd Airborne Division from the Salm River area in the face of attacks from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, is often regarded as one of the worst blunders of the battle, since it resulted in 6th Panzer Army pushing as far west as the Orthe River, and a series of battles at Mannheim that didn't go very well for the Americans. What was the rationale behind this decision, and could the 82nd Airborne have held the line at the Salm if they hadn't retreated? In order to do this, we're going to go through a brief account of the major events of the Bulge, so we're all on the same page, and then assess the 82nd Airborne and Montgomery's decision. So, a couple of disclaimers. 1. I'm not a fan or a hater of Montgomery. I don't really have an opinion of him right now, and I'm certainly not here to defend him. Nor am I pro-British or pro-American, or anti-British or anti-American. I don't do tribal politics. I will be praising and criticising individuals, but that's on their individual action and doesn't reflect the army or country they fought for. And 2, I intend to do a proper in-depth Battlestorm video on this in the future, but obviously, being in the middle of the Stalingrad series, currently paused, I can't do that right now, so I reserve the right to either change my mind or back up the points I make here when we get to that. Ideally, I would have answered Mason's question during the Battle of the Bulge Battlestorm video, but I feel bad enough making him wait for as long as I have done, so I'm just going to answer him right now. At the Bulge, the initial American infantry divisions facing the Germans were not only outnumbered, but were either green troops with little combat experience, or veteran divisions that had been battered by previous actions. They were also told that this was a quiet sector, used by the Americans for training and resting, and that the most the Germans could really do was send the odd battalion-sized force at them. Well, the reason why this area of the front was like this was due to Eisenhower's broad front strategy. Allied divisions were spread out over a wide front of over 500 miles, so that the Germans would also be spread out over a wide front too. And yes, this strategy absolutely plays to the strength of the Allies, who have the advantage of manpower and material. But they didn't have unlimited numbers. So this part of the front was stationed with weaker units which were spread out over twice the length of front normally assigned to a division to defend, and there were no reserves. In fact, there wasn't a single reserve division in the entire 12th Army group. Bradley believed this was fine though, because the hilly and wooded terrain would make it difficult for an attack, even though this was the exact terrain the Germans had attacked through in 1940. The Germans recognised the weaknesses of the American units here, and were able to smash through this thin line with relative ease in the first couple of days. Now, some people will complain about my explanation here, because one of the big debates regarding this is whether Monty's strategy to do a narrow front was better or worse than Eisenhower's strategy to do a broad front. I don't really have an opinion on this at this moment in time, but both strategies have pros and cons, and in the case of the broad front strategy, yes, it has loads of pros, but one of the cons is that your troops are going to be spread out. It doesn't just stretch the enemy thin, but it can also stretch you thin as well, which is what happened here. However, at this time, partly because of his controversial broad front strategy, which was, as we've seen, why Middleton's 8th Corps was so stretched, Schaeff had few theatre reserves. In fact, the only combat-ready formations to hand were two tired American Airborne Divisions, the 82nd and 101st, still recovering and re-equipping in the Rheims area after Operation Market Garden in September. There was also the 17th Airborne Division, but that was in Britain and wouldn't be able to intervene until the weather cleared on the 23rd. Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive on the 16th of December 1942. Initially, 83,000 Americans with 424 armoured vehicles, tanks and tank destroyers faced off against 200,000 Germans and 1,420 armoured vehicles, over 600 of which were panzers. Yeah, there were problems with the American divisions in this sector, but it's no wonder that some of the green units, like Jones's 106th Golden Lions Division, were overwhelmed. They were totally surprised, overextended, and massively outnumbered. Some of the riflemen only had 40 rounds of ammunition because they hadn't expected to fight, and ran through those rounds on the first day. Their telephone lines were cut by the German artillery fire, and they had little experience using radios. One of their artillery battalions fired off all 2,600 rounds they had, and still the German Volksgrenadiers advanced. So it's no wonder that the Germans broke through the lines. Some formations fled, with officers and generals having to run about to try and rebuild the lines over the first couple of days, but others fought to the death, even successfully counterattacking in some places, and at the Eisenhower Ridge they managed to stop the German advance entirely. Further south, 2 battalions from the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division, plus 2 companies of tanks, had been outnumbered 5-1, and had resisted so stubbornly that the Germans had failed to achieve their day's objectives. And this caused frustrations for some of the German commanders, with Piper so eager to get going that he ran straight into minefields that German troops had laid in September. He had to ruthlessly order his fully manned half-tracks to drive into them to clear a path. He also did bad things, but I'm not allowed to talk about those things, as other history channels have been wiped from YouTube for mentioning such incidents. So all I can do is praise the YouTube censors for denying history and helping the National Socialist cause. Klaus, are these the bad guys? Most Allied commanders reacted immediately, including Montgomery, who cut short his game of golf when he received the news of the attack. Eisenhower, who had just been promoted to a 5-star general, was celebrating by drinking and playing bridge with General Bradley when General Strong made a relaxed report of what was happening at the front. This was 12 hours after the attack had begun, and not realising the seriousness of the situation, they continued to drink and finish off their game. Bradley wasn't so concerned, but Eisenhower was convinced that it wasn't just a spoiling attack, and decided to commit 2 armoured divisions, one from the north, one from the south, as reinforcements for Middleton. The problem at this early stage of the battle was that Eisenhower didn't have enough information. In fact, Montgomery had more information at this stage than Eisenhower did, because he had liaison officers in the American armies, so they were feeding back information to Montgomery, whereas the American generals were somewhat blinded by the fact that their officers and headquarters were located far apart from each other, their telephone wires were cut by the German artillery, and their generals themselves were independently struggling to come to terms with what was happening. When he was informed, Hodges of 1st Army hardly even reacted, and was slow in sending the requested 1 infantry and 2 armoured divisions to the Ardennes. This was partly due to a communication issue, the fact he had a cold, but also because Hodges just didn't think the Germans would attack with such large numbers. Though his 1st Army Headquarters War Diary has recently been published, Courtney Hicks Hodges remains the most enigmatic of the senior US commanders and open to much retrospective criticism. Nonetheless, Eisenhower's staff, Walter Bedell Smith, Kenneth Strong and Major General Jock Whiteley, laid out a map of the area and figured out that the objective of the German attack was to split the American and British forces from one another. They also realised that there were 2 main transportation hubs in the area, St. Vith and Bastogne. Thus, Eisenhower ordered his airborne divisions to move to them. It was early in the morning of the 17th of December, the 2nd day, when the airborne units were notified of their new missions, but it wasn't until the 18th that they really got going. The airborne divisions weren't battle-ready. Many of their men were visiting bars and bordellos when the call to arms was raised. For the 101st Airborne, it was 120 miles to Bastogne, and they made up a portion of the 60,000 men now moving towards the front. The 101st only reached the Bastogne area in the early morning of the 19th of December, day 4 of the battle. Morris's 10th Armoured Division was borrowed from Patton, much to his frustration, and Hasbrook's 7th Armoured Division was moving up too from Simpson's 9th Army. The fact that there were some spare armoured and airborne divisions later led to the theory that Eisenhower had deliberately weakened his front to entice the Germans to attack, and then counterattack their flanks. But they had to borrow the armoured divisions from other armies, and airborne divisions aren't meant to be on the front line. They're airborne divisions. They're meant to be behind the lines, preparing for their next assault. So for these, and for other reasons, the theory doesn't work out. Our failure to foresee that those signs pointed to an attack through the Ardennes, ironically enough, spared us heavier casualties when it came. For had we doubled our divisions across Middleton's thin 8th Corps front, we could not have withstood the weight of von Rundstedt's powerful offensive. With the 24 divisions he was to throw into the Bulge, the enemy could have broken a hole anywhere in our line. He may not have been able to advance as far as he did had he dragged through heavier defences, but he would have undoubtedly inflicted more casualties upon Middleton's troops in the effort. Interestingly, at a meeting at Verdun on the 19th of December, Patton joked to those present, including Eisenhower, "Let's have the guts to let the sons of female dogs go all the way to Paris, then we'll really cut 'em up and chew 'em up." Apparently, everyone in the room laughed, and it's obviously a joke. But if you think about it, it's actually not a bad strategy. The further the Germans go west, and the more the Bulge bulges, the more the Germans have to commit their infantry to holding the flanks. Thus, not only does the tip of the spear get weaker, but the whole spear does as well, opening up the possibility for counterattacks. In fact, this is the major problem of the German strategy of Blitzkrieg, as it's commonly known. The Schwerpunkt, the heavy blow, would form a bulge or a wedge that was vulnerable on the flanks. It was often difficult and costly to stop the actual spear point, but by hitting them on the flanks, this drew units away from the spear point, weakening it so it couldn't go any further. The Soviets used this tactic at Kursk and elsewhere, and you don't actually want to stand in the way of the spear, you want to be hitting the flanks, and here it is arguably America's best general saying exactly that at the time, as did another of Eisenhower's generals before the battle. If they come through here, we can fall back and fight a delaying action to the Meuse. Certainly we could slow them down until you hit them on the flanks. Interestingly, on the 18th, Eisenhower had been worried that the Germans wouldn't penetrate deeply enough to allow a proper counterattack to take place. And some of his officers even said that if they didn't allow the Germans to take ground, they might pull back themselves. Eisenhower, though, was of the opinion that there was no need for a mousetrap, as he called it. And obviously Eisenhower had no intention of allowing the Germans to reach Paris. In fact, in response to Patton on the 19th, he stated that they wouldn't let them cross the Meuse River. But the strategy was the same. Stop the German advance at or before the Meuse and hit them on the flanks. From the south, Patton would come up with a whopping 3 armoured divisions. The only question was, who would strike from the north? And that, of course, would have to be a joint American and British force, which then meant Montgomery may now have to take over. Now, the actual debate over this is more complicated, with Bradley, for example, later arguing that it was a mistake to give the British command of the Northern Front, concluding that the Americans could have handled it themselves. However, because Bradley and Hodges had lost communication with each other, this showed Eisenhower that the Americans were in trouble and needed help. When told by Eisenhower that Montgomery was taking over the Northern Front, which included several American divisions, Bradley said he resigned, but Eisenhower refused to accept it. Nonetheless, Bradley later came up with the idea that all this was some sort of British plot. While there is a debate over this, with some saying that Monty hadn't even proposed the idea, while others said he did, but regardless, Bradley himself admitted that the Northern Front should have been given a separate command. He just wasn't happy it was Montgomery who got that command. He wanted another American general to take over. But the point of all this is to say that Monty was given command of the Northern Front and Bradley retained the Southern Front for the purposes of this battle. Dividing the battlefield in two was a sensible strategic move because command and control of such a large area was becoming impossible for one army group headquarters. Lines of communication were stretched to breaking point, and the split would allow each army group commander to concentrate on his own part of the battlefield. Involving 21st Army Group in the battle would also encourage Montgomery to deploy British reserves to the Ardennes. Nonetheless, Monty's appointment rubbed the American generals up the wrong way. To one of the members of his entourage, Montgomery seemed to stride into US 1st Army headquarters like Christ come to cleanse the temple. The Americans had rebuffed Montgomery in happier times, but now, in their hour of trial, they deigned to call on him. In Montgomery's view, had they but listened to him, followed the strategy he advocated, made him the overall ground commander, no hour of trial would have arrived. Yes, Montgomery was an arrogant upper-class twit. No one's denying that. So it's no wonder that the American generals weren't happy that he got given command of the Northern Front. But that bias, which was prompted by Montgomery's pompous attitude, led them to scrutinise every action Montgomery took during the battle, some of which we'll hear about shortly. And I'm not saying that Montgomery didn't make any mistakes, but this entire debate about the 82nd Airborne or St. Vith or whatever comes from this conflict within the Allied command. The question is, was it fair criticism? Or was it an exaggeration due to the rivalry that was going on? That's what we need to figure out. Bradley explained his reasoning for opposing Monty's appointment. Certainly, if Monty's were an American command, I would agree with you entirely, Bedell-Smith. It would be the logical thing to do. In this moment of decision, I could not tell him that what I feared most was the likelihood that this forced changeover would discredit the American command. However, he then says, unless the changeover were clearly explained by Schaeff, it could be interpreted as a loss of confidence by Eisenhower in me, or more significantly, in the American command. If, as a result of the shift, the public were to lose confidence in me, Eisenhower could quickly remedy that situation by sending me home. But if his action were taken to mean repudiation of the American command, if it were inferred that we were bailed out by the British, the damage could be irreparable to our future role in the war. No, he was looking out for his own skin, but then trying to paint it here as if he was trying to save the American command's reputation? It's an exaggeration. No one interprets it as if the British bailed out the Americans. That's not what happened. But you can see now why there's such controversy over this, and Montgomery's comments after the battle. They couldn't allow any credit to go to the British. This was an American battle with American troops, and it was a stunning victory for the Americans. If the British did get involved, it was only a minor thing, and this had to be an American victory, so any suggestion that the British were involved had to be crushed, because the mere hint that this wasn't a purely American victory would be too much for the American pride to take. Except it's not. This was an American victory, even if Monty and a handful of British troops were involved, so all this is just a distraction to the main point, which is that Bradley himself was worried that he was going to lose his job and his reputation. So he was like, look over here, not over here. In reality, putting Montgomery in charge is just a practical solution to the communication problem. It has little to do, or nothing to do, with Bradley's capabilities as a commander, and despite the criticism, Montgomery had traits that suited him well in this battle. Montgomery had been left for dead on the battlefield as a young officer in 1914. Throughout that war, he hated generals who threw their men into battle regardless of the casualties. Ever since 1942, when he had gone out to take command of the 8th Army, he had always been mindful of his soldiers, trying to keep casualties to a minimum. Now his first concern was the men of the 106th and 28th Divisions. So far, no American general, from Eisenhower through Bradley right down to Middleton, had shown one bit of interest in the welfare of the men who had taken the brunt of the fighting, nor would they ever do afterwards. The GIs of the 106th and 28th had been expendable. They had played their role, and that was that. Charles Whitting there being a British author who was gunning for Monty and Great Britain. No wonder his book got mixed reviews. But anyway, calling it cautious or silly, this was the attitude that Monty had. It was born of hard-won experience. American commanders hadn't faced the same problems that the British command had in either the First or the Second World Wars, and just simply couldn't relate to British insecurities. They had a more optimistic view of warfare, which Monty couldn't relate to either. In a sense, it's a clash of styles, so it's worth bearing this in mind. On the 19th of December, the front line looked like this. It's clear that the situation at St. Vith was looking terrible. A mixed American force, including a full armoured division plus elements from other divisions, was in the area and was being flanked on both sides. The pressure was intense, which led to the formation of a horseshoe front. Morale was also dropping fast as a result of all this, plus the realisation that 2 entire regiments from the 106th Division had been wiped out. Even though they weren't surrounded yet, supply convoys were having to battle their way through to the defenders, and rations of food, fuel and ammunition were reduced as a result. In the case of ammunition, usage was cut to a third, and artillery were ordered only to fire if the situation was critical. Supply depots had been seized by the Germans, and on the 21st, Manteuffel's forces attacked to try and eliminate the resistance. To say the situation was tense was an understatement. In fact, some withdrawals had already happened. But this force was now under the command of General Ridgway, the commander of 18th Airborne Corps, and Gavin's 82nd Airborne had been moved to the area northwest of St. Vith and were currently under attack by the infamous Kampfgruppe Piper. Piper and his attached troops had started the battle with 5,800 men, 80 half-tracks and 84 medium tanks, roughly half each of Panzer IVs and Panthers. He also had 30 slow King Tiger tanks bringing up the rear. But by the time they were fighting the 82nd, they had certainly much less than that. Piper had to find a way over the Salm, and on the 17th he reached Trois Pommes, where an American anti-tank gun immobilised one of his Panthers. American engineers then blew up the bridges ahead of him, so he went to Chanou on the 18th and managed to capture the bridge intact. But as he reached Habillemont, the bridge was blown, preventing him from proceeding west. The 82nd Airborne had entered the battle on the 19th, and had orders to make contact with the units defending St. Vith, because at this point the force at St. Vith were basically isolated. From Hodges' point of view, backed by Bradley, he wanted to hang on to St. Vith so he could close the gap between there and Malmedy. He therefore justified pushing the 82nd up to the Salm River by saying that they had to protect the flank of the St. Vith force. So, over the next day or so, the 82nd Airborne moved forwards from Webermann, along with 3rd Armoured Division, in order to both engage the Germans, but also make contact with the St. Vith garrison. On the 21st, Hodges wanted Ridgway to break through to St. Vith with the 30th Division and the 3rd Armoured Division, thus surrounding the German spear point. This was why the 82nd Airborne weren't blowing bridges in their area, even though they had primed them to explode, because they wanted to use those bridges in the planned counterattack. Now, mainly due to German resistance and Piper changing his attack direction to the north, this planned counterattack didn't happen. But this was the reason why the 82nd Airborne was deployed the way it was. By the way, the 82nd Airborne and other nearby units had whittled Kampfgruppe Piper down substantially, By the time his attacks were called off, Piper was down to just 800 men out of his original 5,800, and he had probably lost about 87 of his original 114 tanks. Exactly how much of this was the 82nd Airborne is hard to tell, but they had played their part. The first thing to do was to see the battle on the northern flank as one whole, to ensure the vital areas were held securely, and to create reserves for counterattack. I embarked on these measures. The original question by Mason asked if the 82nd Airborne's role in stopping Piper was comparable to the 101st Airborne's epic at Bastogne, the latter gaining the lion's share of the fame. Obviously, the 101st Airborne's achievement at Bastogne are fantastic. It's a major logistics centre, they were surrounded, they held on, it draws off reserves, etc. However, the Germans were going northwest. Bastogne is in the south. It does have a wider impact on two German armies, and then a domino effect over the entire campaign, but holding on to Bastogne would have been for nothing if the Germans had broken through in the north and raced off to Antwerp. So it's no surprise it gets all the fame and fortune, but what happens in the north with the 82nd Airborne and other nearby units, stopping Piper and the rest of the German forces, is arguably more important. As Bradley says in his memoirs, it wasn't until after the war that the Allies knew that the Germans were heading north towards Antwerp. If this had been 1940, and the Germans were heading south towards Sedan, then holding Bastogne would have been extremely important because it would have been right in the centre of the German advance. But in the Bulge, St. Vith is actually more important, along with other places in the north. And I'm not the only one to say this. In tactical importance, that road centre at St. Vith was even more valuable than Bastogne itself. Which is why, on the 22nd, Montgomery ordered the Americans at St. Vith to form a perimeter and prepare to be supplied from the air, similar to Bastogne. But Hasbrouck, commander of the American 7th Armoured Division, argued the night before that his troops had almost been destroyed and that he wished to withdraw. The message Hasbrouck sent is long, but basically he was of the opinion that he was about to be cut off and that his entire southern flank was wide open. By this point, St. Vith itself had been lost because the Americans had been forced to withdraw, and from Monty's point of view, he saw that the Germans were in the rear areas anyway, especially from the south. A salient at St. Vith, sticking out far beyond other positions, merely absorbed troops needed elsewhere and endangered their existence. He told Hodges of 1st Army, "They can come back with all honour. They must come back to the more secure positions. They have put up a wonderful show." But Ridgway still believed that they could hold on, since the 82nd Airborne was building a line to the north. That's fine, but at the same time, the 2nd SS Das Reich Panzer Division was battling to take the town of Baroque de Freteur. In fact, Gavin of the 82nd Airborne visited the place because he was concerned that his flank was about to be torn open, and he had nothing to plug the gap with. This is his account. "I went to the town of Freteur and proceeded from there towards the crossroads. I encountered such a tremendous volume of fire that it was Sudoku to go any further. Small arms fire was ricocheting in all directions. Interspersed with this was artillery, mortar and tank fire." Well, the crossroads fell that evening, the 22nd, and Gavin now feared that his own division was about to be surrounded. General Rose of 3rd Armoured Division told Gavin that he didn't have much to plug the gap. Gavin himself pulled out a single battalion to counterattack against the entire Das Reich Panzer Division, but realised that this was a stupid idea. He believed it would be better to pull back and use his paratroopers to protect the flank of the 3rd Armoured Division. I would also like to point out that the force holding St. Vith had severely delayed the German attack, allowing the Allies to bring up their reinforcements, including the 82nd Airborne Division. But holding St. Vith now was kind of pointless, since reinforcements were now arriving, and the Germans were moving beyond it. Getting an armoured division surrounded just doesn't make sense at this point of the battle. It's better to withdraw it and then counterattack alongside the other reinforcements. So the withdrawal from the St. Vith area began. On the 22nd and 23rd, under difficult circumstances, Hasbrouck and the remnants he had withdrew to Welsau. But the flank was still open. Gavin and Ridgway plus others believed that the Das Reich Panzer Division would strike towards Liège, which would mean a thrust straight through Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division, itself defending against the attacks in the east. In other words, Gavin would be completely outflanked and struck in the side and rear in a classic hammer and anvil situation. This is the reason they withdrew, since they probably couldn't hold on if they held the line. They would get mauled, and it was Ridgway who initially gave the order to Gavin to reconnoitre for a defensive line in the rear. Gavin protested because he also didn't like withdrawals and hadn't withdrawn so far in the war, but in this instance Ridgway insisted on the preparation for a withdrawal, stating that the flank was exposed. On the 24th, Ridgway issued a warning order to prepare for a possible withdrawal. However, Ridgway got a lucky break. He didn't have to issue the order to withdraw, because Monty entered his headquarters on the morning of the 24th of December. Monty said that they had to shorten the line in preparation for a counterattack. Monty ordered Ridgway to give the order to withdraw to the line that Ridgway and Gavin had already decided upon. Now, according to some accounts, Ridgway didn't agree with Monty's order, but gave it anyway. No, it wasn't Monty's order entirely. This is an excuse. Ridgway doesn't like to retreat and doesn't want to admit that he gave an order to retreat. He had to blame someone else, and Monty was a perfect scapegoat. If the 82nd had won terrain by spilling blood, they should not then have to relinquish it, Ridgway felt, especially on the command of a foreign general. Ridgway was an airborne soldier, not given to worrying about being surrounded, and not accustomed to giving ground. But Gavin actually agreed with Monty. Gavin admitted the new orders shortened the sector allocated to the 82nd by about 50%, thus enabling us to do much better on the defensive. That it was far superior in terms of fields of fire and cover for the defenders, and he would be in a much better position to launch a counterattack from it, but it still went against his division's motto of "no ground gained is ever relinquished." On the 24th, Christmas Eve, the Das Reich Division advanced to Mannheim and then Grandemil. It wasn't clear if they were going to head further north, even though the 3rd Armoured Division was moving in, but the 82nd Airborne had already withdrawn. Thus, the decision had already been made. From a tactical point of view, Gavin's line had been all over the place, and the new line put it in order. As Monty said, it made it tidy. We've also got to bear in mind that, though well trained, airborne divisions were weaker in terms of equipment than a standard infantry division. You can't expect them to hold a higgledy-piggledy line against elite German panzer formations. They'll get chopped up and slaughtered. So, from the 82nd Airborne Division's point of view, their motto notwithstanding, this was a fantastic order. It also wasn't clear if 3rd Armoured Division would have been able to stop the Germans. They did end up doing so, but that battle would take 2 or 3 days to play out. The controversial bit, as Mason put it, is that it may have allowed the 6th Panzer Army's units to go further west. But is this really the case? Piper was stopped by the 82nd Airborne days before this point. He actually went northeastwards before being surrounded and forced back on the 24th or 25th. A lot of the Germans fighting in the Mannheim area were from the south and had nothing to do with the 82nd Airborne Division's retreat, or even the retreat from St. Vith. The Das Reich Division was already behind the 82nd before it retreated. Yeah, maybe other units did move west, but had the 82nd been hit in the flank and rear, they would have been annihilated, and then the Germans would have moved west anyway. So really, I would say that the decision to slightly pull back the 82nd had no major impact on the battle. It was the withdrawal of the US 7th Armoured Division and other elements from St. Vith, and then the Salm River area that supposedly opened up the front. But when you understand the circumstances, you realise that actually it was US Commander Hasbrouck who was calling for the retreat. He made it clear that he was almost surrounded and that his force couldn't hold on. Monty ended up agreeing with him just because it was a silly position to hold anyway, plus the salient had been bypassed. That's why it was a salient, and they were in serious danger of being surrounded. It was Ridgway that disagreed with Monty and Hasbrouck. Hasbrouck, Hoger, Clark and Rosebaum were all decidedly unhappy with Ridgway's defensive plan to form a perimeter at Welsau. Hasbrouck wrote out a long recital of the situation in the salient for transmission to Ridgway. First, he called attention to the dearth of roads and to the fact that all supplies would have to come over a single bridge at Welsau. Then he pointed out that even that bridge might be denied should the 2nd SS Panzer Division, identified south of the salient, drive the airborne troops back even as much as 3,000 yards. Hasbrouck also said his forces were battered and couldn't hold if another major attack was launched against them. He was actually fearing the loss of his whole division and wrote as much. He recommended to one of Montgomery's liaison officers that he be allowed to withdraw. Montgomery spoke to Hodges, and Hodges reluctantly agreed with Montgomery and Hasbrouck. Hodges then gave the order to Ridgway, who still wasn't happy and personally challenged Hasbrouck, asking him if he had read the message he had sent before signing it. To which Hasbrouck replied that he had. Hasbrouck explained the situation again, but Ridgway insisted that he talk to each commander within the 7th Armoured Division first. After this, he relieved both Hasbrouck and Jones, the commander of the 106th Division, but Hasbrouck was reinstated 12 hours later. His short dismissal reveals the US reluctance to give up ground. While admirable in itself, this reluctance sometimes flew in the face of military realities. American generals did not like withdrawing whatever the circumstances, and the consequences for their reputations could be serious, blighting an entire career. Field Marshal Montgomery had no such inhibitions about withdrawing or defending or attacking. He did whatever made sense at the time, and the sensible decision on 21st December was to withdraw the 7th Armoured from St. Vith. Interestingly, in his memoirs, Ridgway's account of what happened is completely different. For starters, he doesn't mention Montgomery in this discussion at all. Ridgway doesn't blame Monty for ordering the withdrawal. Secondly, Ridgway gives the impression that he wanted to withdraw, but when he told Hasbrouck that he was going to get him out of there, Hasbrouck asked, "How can you?" This response was supposedly the reason why Ridgway relieved Hasbrouck, because it showed Ridgway that Hasbrouck's character was failing. The problem is that this account is not only countered by other evidence provided by historians, which we've already been over, but it doesn't make sense. Think about it. Ridgway supposedly said that he was going to get Hasbrouck out of there, and Hasbrouck asked, "How can you?" It's a simple question, and Ridgway had no answer. Why didn't he have an answer? Because he had no units in the area. He had nothing to help Hasbrouck with. If this conversation did occur the way Ridgway said it did, which I doubt, I think we're missing context, then all it does is prove that Ridgway made an empty promise to Hasbrouck, who then challenged him directly on it correctly. Montgomery isn't in the picture. The question of whether they should or shouldn't withdraw is mute because Ridgway supposedly wanted to withdraw, thus making this the correct decision, and it turns out that none of this is how it went down anyway. Ridgway was the one disagreeing with the idea of withdrawing, and that's why Hasbrouck was relieved, because Ridgway didn't want him to withdraw. That makes more logical sense than the account Ridgway gave. Unlike Hasbrouck, Jones wasn't reinstated, as his division had basically been destroyed. Ridgway made him deputy commander for 18th Airborne Corps to soften the blow, but Jones had a nervous breakdown and was sent to hospital. Bearing in mind that this was all after the order for withdrawal had been sent. Montgomery had already given the green light. So why was Ridgway so adamant that the salient be held? It went against his gut instinct. Though he understood the reason for pulling the armoured troops out from St. Vith, he was also aware that the 101st Airborne in Bastogne was surrounded and about to be supplied from the air. It seemed as though one rule had been applied to St. Vith and a second to Bastogne. Yes, because these were different circumstances. What Ridgway didn't realise is that Patton had boasted at the conference at Verdun that he could get 3 armoured divisions ready for a counterattack in less than 24 hours. Now, he didn't launch the attack that quickly. He did a great job, it just wasn't quite as quickly as he boasted. But the point is that the higher commanders understood that the 101st Airborne at Bastogne would have Patton's tank divisions coming to relieve them. Monty did have some spare divisions. He actually moved 3 infantry and 1 armoured division into reserve positions behind the Meuse to counter any crossings. But he didn't have 3 armoured divisions spare to strike south in a similar way that Patton was doing. And he wasn't allowed to. The Americans wanted to fight this battle alone. Therefore, he couldn't guarantee that the US 7th Armoured Division could be relieved if it was trapped in a pocket. Let's also consider that Monty had just lost an entire airborne division during Operation Market Garden. So it's understandable why he wouldn't want an armoured division surrounded behind enemy lines. It's also different having an airborne division surrounded than having a tank division surrounded. Airborne divisions are light infantry divisions, easier to supply and trained to be surrounded. Tank divisions are fuel-guzzling monsters that aren't trained to be surrounded. Armour is an offensive weapon, created essentially to exploit a breakthrough achieved by infantry or armour, or a combination of both. Few commanders of armoured combat commands and divisions would endorse the use of their tanks, self-propelled tank destroyers, half-track mounted infantry and self-propelled artillery in a defensive role. Yet there are obviously times when a commander has no choice but to use his armour defensively. When that happens, no armoured commander wants to be bound by the dictum to hold a static defensive line at all costs. Impose maximum delay, but give ground rather than be overwhelmed, then counterattack. Not necessarily to regain and hold the ground relinquished, but to impose further delay. The object, to take full advantage of armour's mobility. In contrast, Ridgway, an airborne commander, was arguing that an armoured division could not only hold a static line, but also be surrounded, just because he didn't like the idea of losing ground. But as the commander of one of the armoured units said, the ground wasn't worth holding. This terrain is not worth a nickel an acre to me. Montgomery had no intention of wasting any further American lives for the sake of prestige. Men were too precious. And regardless of the battlefield situation, it would be silly to allow a now battered armoured division to be surrounded when there was no guarantee of immediate relief. And in the end, it didn't really impact the battle in a negative way. It just meant that the line was a bit further north and west than it otherwise would have been. But Ridgway's view was different. In time of battle, when victory hangs in the balance, it is necessary to put down any sign of weakness, indecision, lack of aggressiveness, or panic, whether the man wears stars on his shoulders or chevrons on his sleeve, for one frightened soldier can infect his whole unit. As I was standing there, a lieutenant with perhaps a dozen men came out of the woods from the fighting, headed toward the rear. I stopped him and asked him where he was going and what his mission was. He told me that he and his men had been sent out to develop the strength of the German units that had reached Mannheim, and that they had run into some machine gun fire that was too hot for them, so they had come back. I relieved him of his command there on the spot. I told him that he was a disgrace to his country and his uniform, and that I was ashamed of him, and I knew the members of his patrol were equally ashamed. I understand where he's coming from, but Ridgway's attitude here is far too stubborn and rigid. It doesn't allow for any flexibility. Sometimes a withdrawal is necessary. Sometimes attacking head-on against machine guns isn't the best thing to do. And I'll be honest, I'm not seeing the controversy. By the time the decision to withdraw was made, the German offensive was running out of steam anyway. Piper had been stopped, and a week into the battle, 250,000 American troops had been redirected to fight in the Bulge sector. 2nd Panzer Army's objective was actually further north, and it was the 82nd Airborne Division plus others who threw the Germans back. Now, it's difficult to judge because I really need to do a Battlestorm video and put every regiment where it was, then I can properly judge it. But from what I've read, it looks like the 82nd Airborne's retreat didn't have the impact that Mason described. Quite the opposite. The retreat from St. Vith and the Somme was a necessary thing because German units to the south had already come up behind them, including the Das Reich Division. Had they not retreated, elements of the 82nd Airborne and the US 7th Armoured Division would have been surrounded at the Somme, west of St. Vith. It just doesn't make sense to argue that this retreat shouldn't have been done. So where does the controversy come from? There was a rivalry between Bradley and Montgomery, and it was Bradley plus Ridgway who were criticising Monty at the time and then later. Assured by Patton that he would soon break through to relieve Bastogne, I was eager to have Montgomery hit the enemy from the north. I therefore begged Ike to prod Montgomery in an effort to speed up that counterattack, but Montgomery would not be hurried. Rather than pinch off the enemy at the middle as Patton and I were eager to do, Monty preferred to halt him by denting the nose of his advance. Montgomery was facing the vast majority of the enemy forces. The Germans were heading northwards towards the Meuse, not south towards Sedan. Therefore, he was dealing with the bulk of the enemy's divisions. Patton was allowed to bring up his armoured divisions, Monty was not. Thus, Monty didn't have as much freedom to mount an attack as Bradley had. It's not because Monty's an idiot, it's because the American forces under his command, like the 82nd Airborne, were fighting hard to stop the German advance. They didn't have enough strength to mount a counterattack. But Bradley cannot admit this, he has to blame Monty. Elsewhere across the flank, Monty was still preoccupied in the task of tidying up his front. The 82nd Division had been ordered back from its salient on the river line behind St. Vith following the 7th Armoured's withdrawal from that position. But when Montgomery proposed a further withdrawal that would have widened the Bulge at that point, both Collins and Ridgway objected so heatedly that Montgomery promptly backed down. In a letter to Hodges, I wrote that although he was no longer in my command, I would view with serious misgivings the surrender of any more ground on his side of the Bulge. Again, it's all about holding ground, regardless of its usefulness, and not realising that the bulk of the German forces were in the north, heading north to strike towards Antwerp. Bradley didn't know this at the time, and even though he found out later, he still couldn't admit this in his memoirs. He has to paint Montgomery as the bad guy in order to save himself and, supposedly, the reputation of the Americans, which is ridiculous because their reputation was never on the line. Here is a map that someone else made of the battle. You can see almost all the arrows are pointing northwest. Very few are heading south. Yes, there is a southern flank, and yes, it is important, but the northern flank is the most important because the Germans were heading towards Antwerp. This is why Bradley is wrong. Yes, Monty made a bunch of stupid remarks after the battle, which then got twisted out of proportion by the ever so trustful media, something we'll cover another day. And this rivalry didn't just start at the Bulge, it started way before this point, and is why I want to cover more battles in the North African campaign, then get to Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and then Normandy before coming back to the Bulge in a proper, in-depth Battlestorm video. because I want to see the progression of this rivalry from the start. So all my American viewers need to be pushing for more North African campaign videos so that we can get to the point where the USA enters the war. But it appears that Bradley and Ridgway criticised Montgomery in every way they could. And there's a lot of valid criticism. But then they also lumped in the St. Vith and Salm retreats on top of that. However, from what I've seen, this wasn't really valid criticism. All the books I've read, all the maps I've looked at, none of it points to the conclusion that these retreats were the worst blunder of the battle. I'm not even sure if it was a blunder, let alone the worst. And we've got to remember, Eisenhower had given Monty the green light to withdraw. Having been told by Eisenhower that he approved giving up ground if necessary in order to gain reserves, Montgomery proposed withdrawing from St. Vith and softening the angle of the northern corner by pulling back from the Eisenhower Ridge. Hodges and his staff saw that as a typical Montgomery manoeuvre, a step to tidy the battlefield. In their view, what American blood had bought, American soldiers held onto. And this hints at the anti-British attitude that Ridgway and Similar had throughout the battle. It started in North Africa, and Eisenhower had to step in on several occasions to deal with Ridgway and the other American commanders who held anti-British views. Now, some of the British also had anti-American views, so this does go both ways. I'm not excusing the British or Montgomery here, but it really does come across as though a handful of American commanders didn't like Montgomery, with good reason, and the British, and thought that anything Monty and the British did was just wrong. Had an American commander proposed this withdrawal, they probably wouldn't have complained. But because it was Montgomery, and he was British, and they didn't like him, they kicked up a fuss when really no fuss was needed. Such was the controversy that Montgomery was basically browbeaten into silence on this battle. I think the less one says about this battle the better, for I fancy that whatever I do say will almost certainly be resented. As a result, he only wrote a few scant pages on the battle and the conference afterwards. Montgomery's memoirs did not appear until 1958, and most of those bitter feelings he refers to appeared before that time, shortly after the war, in the published memoirs of the American commanders, accounts which never failed to condemn the Field Marshal for his various failings, personal and professional. On the matter of the Ardennes, their allegations are that Monty's interventions in the battle were by no means as important as he claimed, that he attempted to hog the credit for an American victory, and generally behaved like his usual arrogant self when dealing with the US Army commanders and Bradley. Oh yes, the controversy is strong. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, but Nealons argues that the Bulge wasn't even an American victory, which I'm sure will make people angry in the comments below. Don't shoot the messenger, I'm just reporting what Nealons says. He says it was a draw, which is a bold statement to say the least. Montgomery also denies a lot of the accusations brought against him, but I also think the reason accounts of this battle usually focus on the actions in the south, specifically at Bastogne with the 101st Airborne, and less so on the actions of the 82nd Airborne, is because Montgomery took over. The retreat from St. Vith and the Salm, plus elsewhere, also aren't as heroic as the stand at Bastogne, even though the south wasn't actually the focus of the German offensive. Camp Grupper Piper gets a lot of attention, but Hasbrook and the 7th Armoured less so. And I think the reason why is because it's more complicated than what happened in the south. The front was all over the place, there were retreats, and the British were involved. All things that make the northern sector more complicated to explain, and also more controversial. It's easier to explain to people that your soldiers held the line than to say that they did a little retreat here, a complicated manoeuvre over there, then counterattacked in this location. It's too much. Most people don't want to hear the nuances. They just want to be told, we fought hard and won. That's it. And that's why the British couldn't be involved or take any of the praise. We've got to remember that this battle has been traditionally seen as a purely American affair, when in reality it wasn't. It was mostly American, but the British were involved to some extent. And the arguments between Montgomery and Bradley, Ridgway, etc. can't be ignored, but at the same time show that the Allies weren't as allied as the propaganda made them out to be. For this reason, it's easier to ignore the British contribution rather than acknowledge it. So, is my assessment based on the books wrong, or is it right? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you want to see Gavin of the 82nd Airborne in action along with the 101st, check out my ancient but also classic documentary on Market Garden right here. I also have follow-up videos discussing Gavin's role in that defeat, so check them out as well. Thanks for watching, bye for now.